Nikolai was high up, the kind of altitude where the wind doesn't just blow, it tests the integrity of your skeleton. He was stripping old solar tiles from the Kintari spire, his movements methodical and slow. The Kintari architects loved their glass and their soaring aesthetics, but they didn't understand how a decade of heat cycles expanded a seam. Nikolai did. He felt the vibration of the building through the thick soles of his boots, a low, industrial purr that spoke of a healthy power grid. Then, without a flicker of warning, the purr died. The EMP hit like a silent hammer. It didn't make a sound, but the world suddenly felt hollow. Below him, the massive city hub of Olaris went dark as lights were sucked into the ground. A heavy, unnatural stillness replaced the city's heartbeat. Nikolai looked down through the skylight. The defense architects, Exor among them, were already scrambling as their holographic consoles turned into dead slabs of glass. Then the backup systems kicked in. These weren't digital, they were physical, analog emergency seals. 9 layers of crystalline shielding slammed into place around the primary generator core with a series of heavy, metallic thuds. These lattices were designed to withstand a siege, deep crust minerals reinforced to remain impassable even if the stars themselves went out. Nikolai wiped a smudge of black roofing tar from his knuckles with a rag that was more grease than cloth. The smell of the tar, thick and chemically sweet, remained the only familiar thing in a world that had just broken. He began his descent. The Kintari thought they were safe behind those walls, but they were actually trapped. You'll want to hear the part that still keeps Exor up at night. I'll show you how a trillion-credit fortress was undone by something that cost 5 cents a century ago. The descent took Nikolai 20 minutes. He didn't use the elevators, which were now nothing more than vertical metal coffins. He used the service stairs, his heavy work boots echoing in the darkness of the stairwell. When he finally reached the generator hall, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the Kintari's sharp, copper-like musk. Exor was shouting at a technician near the primary seal. The resonance locks are engaged. Without a frequency pulse from the main hub, we are sealed in a tomb. Nikolai didn't shout. He reached into the deep pocket of his work trousers and pulled out a small, scarred wooden box. It was barely the size of his palm, the finish worn away by 3 generations of hands. A brass crank stuck out from the side, polished to a dull glow by time. Exor stopped mid-sentence. The alien's secondary eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of severe cognitive friction. He looked at the roofer, then at the box. "What is that?" Exor asked, his voice tight. "My grandfather's," Nikolai said quietly. He used it to find the weak points in the slate. The generator core sat at the center of the hall, encased in 9 concentric rings of violet crystal. Each ring was a foot thick. They were beautiful and they were impassable. The Kintari technicians were currently trying to bypass the manual overrides with handheld batteries, but the crystals didn't care about voltage. They were designed to absorb energy, not yield to it. Nikolai stepped past a pile of discarded high-tech scrap. He didn't look at the sophisticated gear. He looked at the floor. He looked at the way the light from the emergency flares refracted through the first shield, which meant the vibrational load was... Exor started to explain to his lieutenant, his 4 hands gesturing toward the structural diagrams on the wall, but the architect trailed off. He was watching Nikolai. The roofer knelt by the base of the first shield housing. He placed his ear against the cold, silent surface of the floor. Beneath the cooling shadow of the crystalline generator, the hall felt like a cathedral of dead gods. Nikolai wasn't looking for a lock. He was listening for a heartbeat. Every structure has one, a natural frequency where the atoms want to dance. In his trade, you find that frequency to know where the roof will leak. Here, he was looking for something else. "You're wasting time, human." One of the technicians spat, his gill slits flaring with irritation. "That shield is a solid-state harmonic lattice. It's built to be indestructible." Nikolai didn't look up. He just felt the rough grain of the music box's wood. He knew exactly what was inside. A series of tiny steel pins on a rotating cylinder. Each one was tuned to a specific note. He set the box on the floor, pinning it tight against the crystal's mounting. Nikolai ran a thumb over the crank. The Kintari architects were masters of the grand design, but they often forgot the small stresses. They built for strength, forgetting that the more rigid a thing is, the more it hates to move. Exor stepped closer, his breathing heavy. He didn't understand the stillness of the human. Nikolai was a creature of gravity and weight. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who was simply tired of the climb. "The crystal won't move for you," Exor whispered. "Everything moves," Nikolai replied. "You just have to ask it the right way." The room was silent, save for the distant, dying hum of the city outside. Nikolai's hand settled on the brass handle. He didn't turn it yet. He just waited, his fingers feeling through the floor for the precise second the station's natural swaying reached its peak. Nikolai tightened his grip on the handle. The loose, rhythmic rattle in the music box's brass winding key vibrated against his palm, a tiny mechanical stutter that mirrored the deep, structural tremor of the floor beneath his boots. It was a familiar sensation, the way a loose slate shudders against a beam before the wind finally catches it. He waited for the two rhythms to find each other, his eyes focused on the mounting of the first shield ring. Exor paced behind him, his many hands twitching in a frantic, uncoordinated pattern that betrayed his sterile, academic panic. The architect was muttering about thermal lances and primary hub overrides. To the Kintari, the world was a series of equations that were currently failing to balance. They didn't understand that when the math fails, you have to look at the joints. But a roofer couldn't possibly. The lead technician started, his voice cracking with a mixture of mockery and genuine desperation. Nikolai turned the crank. The first note was a sharp, clear plink that seemed to hang in the air, defiant and out of place in the high-tech graveyard of the generator hall. Then came the second note. Then the third. The tinny, mechanical melody of a child's lullaby began to fill the room, echoing off the violet crystal walls like a haunting ghost. "You're listening to the song," Nikolai said, his voice a steady anchor against the rising whine of the crystal. "You built this spire to be perfect. You tuned the crystalline lattices to a specific structural pitch so they wouldn't crack during orbital shifts. But when you make something that rigid, you give it a weakness." The first shield ring began to glow. It wasn't the soft, protective light of a powered grid, but a jagged, flickering violet that pulsed in time with the music box. "The secret is in the resonance," Nikolai continued, his hand moving with a precision that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with physics. "Every material has a natural frequency where it wants to fall apart, and yours happens to be 440 hertz. In my grandfather's time, it was just the A note that kept the kids asleep, but here it's a hammer." The whine intensified, reaching a pitch that made the Kintari technicians cover their auditory sensors in pain. Nikolai didn't flinch. He watched the surface of the crystal, waiting for the first sign of harmonic fatigue. Forced harmonic vibration exponentially compounds kinetic energy within rigid crystalline structures, and once that energy starts to bounce back and forth inside the lattice, it has nowhere to go but out, he explained, the words coming out in short, punctuated breaths as he increased the speed of the crank. The air in the room seemed to thicken. The violet glow reached a blinding intensity. As the melody hit the final refrain of the first verse, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted violently, sending a shockwave of shattered energy across the floor that glittered like fallen stars, stripping away the remaining layers of the invincible defense grid in a single, deafening pulse of pure physics. The sound was like a million glass flutes shattering at once. The first ring dissolved into fine, violet dust that swirled in the sudden draft. The second ring followed a heartbeat later, then the third, then the fourth. A cascading failure of acoustic resonance ripped through the concentric shields, turning the indestructible walls into a shimmering mist that coated the floor in a layer of crystalline sand. It worked. The trillion-credit generator stood naked and exposed in the center of the hall. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the faint, dying rotation of the music box's internal cylinder. Then the backup lights flickered. A hum began deep within the walls, surging upward until the primary power grid roared back to life with a triumphant, electric surge. The darkness was gone. Exor stood frozen, His secondary eyelids pinned wide as he stared at the mountain of violet dust at Nikolai's feet. He looked at the technician, then back at the human, who was slowly standing up and wiping his tar-stained hands on his rag. "What kind of weapon is that?" Exor whispered, his voice trembling with a new, terrified kind of awe. Nikolai closed the lid of the box with a soft click. He looked at the defense architect, his expression unreadable in the bright, artificial glare of the restored lights. He didn't look like a soldier. He just looked like a man who had finished a long day's work. "That's just gravity," Nikolai said. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't ask for a reward. He simply tucked the wooden box back into his pocket and headed for the service stairs. He had a roof to finish, and the suns would be setting soon. The high-tech world of the Kintari would spend decades trying to understand the acoustic profile of that specific lullaby. It would eventually be banned across 4 sectors, classified as a Grade A vibrational weapon. But to Nikolai, it was just the sound of a job done right. The antique music box sat quietly on the scarred wood of the roofer's workbench later that evening. The brass key was still warm from the friction of the crank, catching the long, fading light of the 3 suns. Beyond the window, the great spire stood silent and unbroken against the darkening sky, a monument to a human who knew how things truly held together.